we're going to begin with a very serious topic now. Um, in the 40-some years since we were students here, a number of our classmates and a number of the faculty we knew and loved, and in some cases feared, are no longer with us. And we don't have time to do tributes to all of them. So we've picked a certain portion of them to do this with. And Frank has put together most of these slides, and we have also had help from Ruth and Robin, who are also going to be speaking. So let's proceed with the first one.
Well, thank you, Denny. I'm Frank, in case there's a problem figuring out which of the three I am. I must have been married when all this social activity took place here, because I don't remember any of it. I do remember Quofat. That I remember. But especially the 1972 Quofat, where 7 of us passed the qualifiers and threw quite a bash over in Williamsburg on the Wabash. I also must have never owned a camera back then, because I don't have any pictures of any of this stuff. None of it. The only other thing I can say is that I wish this had been done a year earlier, because I'm getting ready to move out of my office now that I'm retired, and I have thrown away and given away tons of stuff, Denny, that I wished I had when I finally heard from you, but it's gone. So anyway, I would like to say a few words about some people that I became very fond of in various ways, even though in one case I didn't know this individual until after we had both left Purdue, and that's Norm Gibbs. But I will start with Saul Rosen, because Saul was the major influence on me in deciding to come to Purdue. I had somehow gotten a copy of his book and read it and decided that this was the place I wanted to be, and the kinds of things that he wrote about or put papers in were the kinds of things that I was really interested in. So I applied to a number of places, but I came out and I visited Purdue in the spring of '70, and I met Saul on a Saturday and Rita Luptowski, and Saul took me on a tour and said that he would offer me an assistantship in the computer center, and Rita registered me for 3 courses, and it was all done, just like that. And I never regretted a minute of it. Eventually, we wrote some textbooks, one of which was on structured Fortran, and I have to give John Rice and a lot of other folks at Purdue who were interested in the various ways of teaching Fortran back in the early '70s, because a lot of the ideas that graduate students and faculty had on teaching Fortran ended up in that book. And there wouldn't have been a book if it hadn't been for that. So I thank you, John, and all the other Purdue people who aren't here for their influence on that textbook, which eventually went on to sell well over 1 million copies. So thank you. Anyway, my quote was not a quote of Saul's, but a quote of his dear wife, Winnie, who, when she found out I was from Maryland and I voted for Spiro Agnew, used to remind me that Maryland's gain was the country's loss, as Spiro went on to become a famous person and then become an infamous person. So he went up and he went down. But you can read about George P. Mahoney sometime, and then you'll understand why I voted for Spiro T. Agnew. I think he's the only Republican I ever voted for in my life. Anyway, this is the only picture I have on my slides, and this is a picture of Saul. Let's see some things about Saul, which I guess most of the people in this audience probably have memorized. He was born in Port Chester, graduated from CCNY 9 years after my father did. He attended the University of Pennsylvania, which is interesting because I didn't know that, and I now live in Philadelphia, and I had no idea that he went to Penn and got his PhD in mathematics in 1950. He was an instructor. He hung around the Delaware Valley area for a number of years before he finally went to Wayne State in '54 to '56 as the associate professor of the computational laboratory. So he spent a lot of time in Philadelphia, and I had no idea that. Of course, at the time, I had spent no time in Philadelphia, so that may be why.
Wayne State's where he met
Is that right? Okay.
Back then in 1962.
Okay. We actually ended up with a president from Wayne State at Temple. It was one of the, probably the most 6 miserable years I spent at Temple was with a president of, a fellow from Wayne State who came to be president of Temple. Some other things about Saul, worked at Electro Data Systems of mathematics section at Burroughs, manager of computer programming and services there. He went on to Philco, chief software designer for the Philco Transact. Some of these things I knew, but I didn't know. We'll hear more about that when we talk about Halstead. More things about Saul when he went on to academics, and Hal's already hit on most of this, so a lot of it may not be new to, is no longer new to anybody here, but he was a professor of mathematics, professor of engineering at SUNY Stony Brook, and then he came to Purdue in 1968, and he was here, was it 1987? Is that when he retired? Is that true? Or is that not true? He was the director of Purdue's Computer Center from 68 to 87. That's the information that I got.
This is way off. Saul came in 62, and he was named director of the computer center soon thereafter.
Look at what it says.
He
He's gone
left
for a
for a
year.
few
He left
years.
for 1 year. 66 to 67, he went to Stony Brook.
Right.
And then he came
And then he came back. Did he not come back?
He came back.
Yeah, he came back. Okay, so, but he wasn't the director of the computer center in 62. He was a professor of mathematics and computer science
Kai held both positions at first.
until 68. So that's,
Got so big so quickly, they decided
Okay.
to split the job.
yep, so that seems about right. He also became active in the ACM. He wrote extensively on systems programming, and the book that he wrote on programming systems and languages was a big influence in my decision to come to Purdue. Oh, Denny's just sitting there relaxed with that thing in his hand. Nobody knows. The fact that he was active in ACM and active in AFIPS, and Halstead was also, and several of the other people, Norm Gibbs was also active. I think Purdue can be really proud of the seeds that these people planted, because many of our graduates from Purdue went on to also be active in service with ACM and AFIP and other organizations, and many of them also went on to chair departments and become active in the Computer Research Association. So I think if you look at the folks who graduated in the 60s and 70s from Purdue, you'll see their names all over the professional organizations in computer science. And I think the faculty here had a lot to do with that. It rubbed off, believe it or not. My recollection of Saul was as a soft-spoken person. He didn't push his students. I remember Joel Ewing talking to me at one point about the fact that Saul just never gave him that shove that he needed to get done in a timely manner. He was soft-spoken. He was a good friend to me, and I think to all of his students. As I said, he interviewed me, and Rita signed me up for courses. It's a good idea. Everybody who's spoken so far talked about good things. To be first is one of them, but it's a good idea to go where you're wanted. And I got the feeling that Purdue wanted me, so I went, and it really changed my life. So that's my recollection of Saul, and a little bit of background on Saul. Couple of documents that I looked at. I should say also that many people who have spoken so far have done a lot of research. I haven't done much research on any of the topics I'm going to talk about, and you know what people do when they don't do their homework. They plagiarize, and they steal from other people. So you'll see later on in the credits that I took a good bit of this information from other sources, and I did it fairly hurriedly, but I was very pleased to be able to do it, and I'm thankful to be here today, because I almost wasn't. With that, I'm going to turn things over now to Ruth, who's going to talk about Ray Boyce, who is somebody I don't think I ever knew.
Well,
So,
Microphone, please.
you should. Well, Ray Boyce was a friend of ours. He was a graduate student. He came in 1968, and he left in 1972 with a PhD. And we think he was the first four-year computer science PhD, certainly in systems. He was a student of Halstead's. Since Denny put up the reference, I want to tell a little story. Several years ago, we live in California, and our daughter was applying to grad school at Claremont Graduate School. And if you know Claremont, it's one of 5 different colleges that are all on the same campus. And she was having this interview, and we walked around, and we happened to come by a building, and we just walked in, and it just by chance happened to be on the Harvey Mudd campus, the Computer Science and Math building. And in the foyer of this building, there was a display case, and it was recognizing an alumnus of Harvey Mudd named Don Chamberlain, whose name you see up there. And it was recognizing him because he had been named Dr. Dobbs's Journal's Programmer of the Year. And we said, we know Don Chamberlain because after Ray and after Guy Hoekazang, who most of you know, left Purdue, they went to IBM Watson Labs in Yorktown Heights, New York. And they played bridge a lot, and one of the people they played bridge with was Don Chamberlain and his wife. And when we used to visit back in New York, because my family lived in New York, we used to play bridge with Don Chamberlain also. We'd get a couple of... Well, Ray left in 1972, and to work at Watson, and in 1973, he and Don Chamberlain moved out to the San Jose research labs, and Guy stayed behind in New York, but they were working for IBM. And what we didn't realize at that time was what they were working on is what became SQL, the database query language, which everybody knows. And so we were reading this article from Dr. Dobbs's journal that was commemorating Don. And in it there was a quote, and if you go to the next slide, it's on there because he made the same quote somewhere else. And you could see this, and it was just amazing. They had a reunion in 1995 of SQL, and here it was. It was Ray, who was a person who made things happen. He was a very smart and very ambitious guy and had a lot of energy. I really think Ray, if he'd lived, would have been in the class with Steve Jobs and Larry Ellison and Bill Gates. Everyone would know Ray's name, I think, if he were alive today. And that was just an amazing quote, because we knew Ray as a kid, as a grad student, as a friend, and we had no idea, but this was from his coworker. Well, in June of 1974, as we were getting ready to leave Purdue, we were about to move to Dayton, we got a phone call from somebody, and I don't remember who it was, and they told us at that time that Ray had had a cerebral hemorrhage, a brain aneurysm. He was still alive at that point. And they told us that he had a choice of having an operation which could give him a normal life but had some risk involved. And if something happened, it would happen in the first week. And he had that operation, and 6 days later, he had more aneurysms and he died. And he was 27 years old. He left a wife and a 10-month-old daughter. And, even when I think about it, it was such a shock to us. And I remember what we did. We called everybody we knew all over the country to tell them, because Ray was such a special person. And we ran up a phone bill of like $160 or something, which we were grad students, didn't have to spend. But one of the things we did was we established with Sandy, his wife, a scholarship in the CS department. And if you go upstairs, I didn't see it yesterday, but people taking the tour said they saw one in Halstead's name and in Rosen's name and in Ray's name. And I doubt that it still has any money in it because it was limited. But he was a special person, and I think we all miss him. So here's what I remember about Ray, if you go to the next slide. Okay. One of the things, if you remember, Ray was about 5'6". He was not tall. But when he... You don't even think he was that tall. But when he was in middle school, he grew up in the New York area, and he told us he played CYO Catholic League basketball, and one of the people he played against was Lou Alcindor. So remember that. The other thing, which Frank you should remember because you played softball with him, and he used to slide into third base, and he'd get up, and his shorts would be spotless, and we never figured out how he did that. He was that kind of person. As I said, he was the first person to get a CS PhD at Purdue. We think he was the first one in 4 years to do it that quickly. He never acted smarter than anybody else. He was just a wonderful person, and he died way too soon, and so we wanted to remember him.
You want me to do Maury, and then we'll, okay.
Yeah, keep
I'm happy to give you some recollections and some background on Maury Halstead, who was somebody that I met when I first came to Purdue. I took his first compiler course, and then I took his second compiler course. I couldn't for the life of me remember the name of the stripped-down version of Neliac, whose compiler we did, but it was Pilot, as somebody reminded me when I was sitting back there. Maury told us, and this is a bit of a paraphrase, but one of the first things he said to us is that it's really important as an introductory graduate student to figure out who it is around here who knows his or her stuff, who you can rely on for good advice, and who you should stay away from because you're likely to get no advice or bad advice. And I kind of took that seriously, and it really worked out that way. Henry Halstead's, oh yeah. I looked up Maury's Henry Halstead, and the first thing I saw was this thing about Henry Halstead's orchestra. Turns out Henry Halstead's orchestra was a big deal, and Henry Halstead was very famous. But anyway, that's the wrong Halstead. One of Maury Halstead's early claims to fame was Neliac, the brainchild of Harry Huskey at NEL, with a lot of support from Maury, who at the time was the head of the computational center at NEL. But Maury, as somebody had talked about earlier, Maury had no computer science background at all when he first got started in his academic professional career. He got a PhD in physical science from Hopkins, became assistant director of climatology, where he did become interested in computer design, but he then went off to do a lot of other things that didn't have a whole lot to do with computing. Eventually, he ended up in NEL, and with Harry Huskey, they invented, so to speak, Neliac, which had a close relationship initially with Algol 58. Eventually, Algol 58 and Neliac parted company. It had a decompiler, which was something that Maury was also always interested in, and I did a lot of decompilation work under Victor Schneider in my later years at Purdue. As you now know, thanks to Hal, it was a bootstrapping, self-compiling compiler, the world's first. You coded it, the compiler was first coded in a simplified form in assembly language, which was called the Bootstrap. And then it was rewritten in its own language, and you kept adding features, and the Bootstrap got thrown away, and you could optimize the compiler, and you could add features until you were blue in the face. And Maury let us add whatever features we wanted to. He didn't care. So most of us did. And it was a fascinating experience and an open-ended one, which was also very exciting. It's one of the first implementations of a compiler for a higher level language. As I said, he didn't start out in computing. He earned his bachelor's degree in meteorology, believe it or not, at Berkeley, with the equivalent of a master's in something called aerological engineering. I looked it up. There is such a thing, or there was. I don't know if there is anymore, at the U.S. Naval Academy. His PhD in physical science from Hopkins. He became, I see there's a little repetition in here, which I should have cleaned up, but didn't. He eventually ended up in Hawaii. I don't quite know how, but he did. And he became known as the Grand Kahuna because of some successful cloud seeding experiences that he had in the 1940s. He taught at Texas A&M, moved to NEL, moved to Lockheed Missiles and Space Company later, led Advanced Software Development Group at and worked on the IBM 7094 Neliac compiler. Then it got moved, go back. got moved to the UNIVAC 1107. I'd like to say one word or two about the 1107. I worked on the 1107 in 1966, and some people were talking about the IBM System 360 operating system. The 1107, I came to find out later, was light years ahead of the operating system on the 360. But for some reason, UNIVAC lost its foothold in the computer world, even though its operating system, whose name I can't remember. Does anybody remember the name of the operating system on the 1107? Nobody knows. Anyway, that operating system was an extremely sophisticated time-sharing system with features that the 360 system didn't get until the 70s, which would 5, 6, 7, 8 years later. Exec 8, thank you. Right on, right. And it was a fascinating system to program. Maury also worked on the 7094, and they ported, decompiled NELIAC to a bunch of different computers. Halstead eventually wrote a book, Machine-Independent Computer Programming, a feat that was, I would say, somewhat sneeringly referred to in Jean Sammet in her famous book. And then he brought NELIAC and the bootstrapping concept with him to Purdue in, I think, 1968. And I first learned about it in his 500-level CS course, and I don't remember the number, 501 or 502. And that's where I first learned about the bootstrap compiling, which we did. We learned by doing. And we wrote a complete bootstrap compiler, and it was a lot of fun and very instructive. Halstead seemed to me to be a fairly laid-back fellow, secure in his own skin and in his accomplishments. There are some people who considered him to be a true pioneer in a number of areas, not just computing technology. I found him to be a little eccentric and a bit of an independent spirit, which was always a pleasure. His door was always open, and he was always open to discussion on just about anything that you wanted to talk to him about. I remember years before it happened, he quipped that only Richard Nixon could possibly break the cold snap between the US and China by actually going to China. And lo and behold, it came to pass. Maury launched himself into a new arena pretty much at the time I was getting ready to leave, but I didn't know about it when I was here at Purdue. The mental effort required to develop computer programs. This interest resulted in the work that he first called software thermodynamics, later software science, or Halstead metrics. He wrote a book about that, which I was going to bring, but when I thought I wasn't going to come, I took it back to work, and then I didn't have it when I got ready to come here. He was a firm believer that CS was not sufficiently experimental, that we didn't measure what we were doing in any sort of scientific way. We were full of anecdotes. We plunged ahead. We did a lot of new things. We built new systems, but we didn't really seriously measure the effect of what we were doing, which I think is an illness that still besets us today, hasn't gone away. He would say something to the effect that you really don't know something until you really know it. The implication being that until you did some experimental research and measurement and some statistical analysis on what you were trying to do, you really can't say that you know this or you know that, or you know that students learn better this way, or that it's better to program in this manner because the engineering of our software would be done in a better way if you use this style. And we all talk about that, but we don't do much to measure it. He was a true believer and practitioner of measuring things, most notably the property of programs, and I think that's probably the major legacy that he has left behind with his books and with his numerous papers, which I don't have a copy of up here, but written with many of the graduate students, including Stu Zwiebin and others who I can't remember offhand. But he really he believed that was a very important thing for us to be able to do, was to become more scientific in our approach to the work that we do.
I wanted to make a couple of comments. I was Halstead's first PhD student, and I was doing a self-compiler, but it wasn't NELIAC, it was a language called MAD, but I was using the same principles. And a couple of thoughts. One of the things I remember that once a week I was supposed to see him to discuss my research. And I'd go to his office and we'd end up discussing his software science. And maybe I'd get 5 minutes to talk about what I was doing. But one of the things I remember is that I don't know exactly what the numbers were, but there was a point somewhere in the early 70s, late 60s, where Halstead had about half of the PhD students. And the reason was that he was the only guy on the faculty who appeared to have been there and done it. Now, that was not a correct perception, but it was the perception of a lot of the students. He came and he had all the experience that Frank talked about. He had run computer centers, he had written programs, he had done all this stuff. And a lot of the other faculty, the perception we had was, oh, their heads are in the cloud discussing theory, but they, we don't want them as our thesis advisor. We want somebody who's been there. That period changed over time, but it was quite an interesting experience, and I highly respected him. One of the most important things he ever taught me was this. He said, don't pretend you know it if you don't. Instead, find out from somebody who does know. And that was a really interesting piece of advice. He gave me a qualifying exam at one point where he said, I expected the answer to be, I don't know. And if you gave the answer, I don't know, and I'll go look it up, that was the correct answer. So, well, I did, but I don't know about anybody else. But anyway, that was kind of an interesting point about Maurice Halstead.
My quals, I took a verbal qual with Saul Rosen and Maury Halstead, and I had a question that I couldn't answer, and I said, I don't know. Having never had that advice from him beforehand, I was wrong. I passed. And I even remember the question. What was it? It was, what's the difference between the structure of, or the syntax of a procedure statement in ALGOL 60 and PL1? In one of them, the type declarations were in the procedure prototype, and the other it wasn't. And I didn't know. I couldn't remember that.
Okay.
We turn things over to Robin.
No.
Is that
we-
right?
we-
No?
we
Oh,
still
I'm
have
going
a
to
few
go on
more
with
for
Norm
you.
Gibbs. Okay. Norm once said when I applied to SEI, he said to Mary Shaw, Friedman's okay. He has good instincts. Well, at this point, that's debatable. But I did have enough of an instinct to retire in December, so I guess partly it was true. A few more things about Norm, mostly taken from an article that Gene Spafford wrote about him. He surely did care about teaching. He cared about students and the profession. He was one of the many graduate students I spoke about earlier who became very active in service in the computing field. He was born now 70 years ago in Keyport, New Jersey. He got a Bachelor's of Science from Ursinus College, again, another person who came up in the Philly and New Jersey area. He got his MS and PhD in '69 from Purdue, 14th recipient of a PhD in computer science. He left the year before I came, so I didn't meet Norm until later on in my years and his. I first met him when he was a faculty member at William & Mary. He helped establish the computer science degree program there, and he was instrumental in hiring the first wave of faculty and mapping out with those faculty what they believed the computer science program ought to look like. He went on to Arizona State University and he established a PhD program there. He was very accomplished at building programs, building new things, and he was also very, very innovative. As we'll see, he went on to Bowdoin College, which I think is still mostly an undergraduate institution, if not totally an undergraduate institution. He served as chairman there, and while he was there, he co-founded the Liberal Arts Computer Science Consortium, or LACS. In 1985, he became the first director of Software Engineering Institute's education program. I went to SEI in '89 to work with Norm and his group in the education program. I thought SEI was a wonderful place, and I couldn't understand, and still can't understand why it hasn't been duplicated in the software engineering area and other areas by our favorite government. I don't get it. It was a fantastic place. He was a perfect fit. He and the people that he brought there were in the forefront of software and engineering education, and they had quite an impact on software engineering education. At SEI, his team was always innovating. They were involved in the development of the early growth of the CERT-CC, the SEI's distance education program, the SEI's continuing education program in software engineering, and the CMU's Professional Master of Software Engineering degree program. At SEI and CMU, he served on numerous other administrative roles, including Professor of Software Engineering. He served as the Director of Information Technology at Guilford College in North Carolina. These are things I didn't have a clue about Norm until I read this. He was Professor in Residence and Executive Director of the Connecticut Information Technology Institute at UConn. He served on the advisory board of Purdue University's Sirius program, and he chaired the Department of Computer Science at Ball State University at Muncie, Indiana, where I had my last contact with him probably 10 to 12 years ago. I went out to review their undergraduate program. That's where I learned, by the way, that we have to be careful about how we assign credits for the courses that we teach, because the faculty at Ball State were extremely frustrated at trying to get some of their courses that didn't have labs to have 4 credits, because they were practicum type courses, and the faculty were taking their students out to actually do what we would now call capstone work, applied work for various organizations, mostly in the Ball State area. And this work that they did, the faculty and the students, and constantly meeting with their clients, took a considerable amount of time, and they couldn't get the administration there to recognize that sometimes there are courses that merit more credits than 3, even though they don't have a lab, and they were extremely frustrated about that, and I've never forgotten that. But Norm innovated at Ball State just as he did at every place else that he had been. He was a true leader in education and research, very active in ACM. He served on council, as I did. He chaired the ACM SIG board in the mid-'80s, no mean feat. He got the SIG-C award for outstanding contributions to computer science education in '94. I enjoyed numerous conversations with Norm, ranging from teaching Fortran to teaching software engineering and the approach to teaching software engineering. He and his crew left an indelible footprint in software engineering education, and I think he deserves a tremendous amount of credit for that, and I think Purdue, as a place from which he got his PhD, deserves a lot of credit for his accomplishments. Moving on to J. Richard Buki, somebody I never quite figured out. He used to, when I would go to his office, which was often a humbling, frightening experience, the first thing he would say to me is, "When are you going to solve a hard problem?" To which I never had an answer, of course. Who shot JR? Probably no one knew. I took his automata course in my first semester at Purdue. I had a really hard time. He was inscrutable, and he could really make you feel like the most insignificant ant on the farm. Paul Young used to tell me, because Paul was my advisor in the first 2 years, I don't know how I got assigned to Paul, but I was indeed really lucky that I did. He and I went to the same undergraduate institution. I struggled to get done there in 5 years. He finished in 3, and he went on and got his PhD at MIT. But he's told me one day that Buki just treated everyone the same way, but it really didn't help me feel much better.
That automata course, I believe that's the one that began for me with the famous quote, "An automata is just a K algebra."
Well, see a little bit of that in this next slide. He was a quiet, unassuming fellow. His wife drove him to and from the math science building. He didn't drive. He used to throw me out of his office at 5 o'clock because his wife had come to pick him up. He seemed to wear the same clothes. His shirt was never tucked in. But the thing I remember most about him is that he spoke about Chomsky and Chomsky's colleagues with considerable disdain. He didn't consider them mathematicians. He considered them symbol manipulators. I'm not sure that I understand what the difference is, because mathematicians manipulate symbols all the time, but if you remember the textbook, whose book was it, Ullman? There was a
Aho and
textbook that almost everybody used for a time.
Hopcroft.
Hopcroft and Ullman.
Yeah.
If you think back about that book and how theorems were proved about automata and the various kinds of automata, you would notice if you looked at Bucky's book, there's the difference is like night and day. Let's go on to the next slide if we can. Bucky used his own book, which was not mimeoed. I'm not quite sure how he got the copies made, but he periodically distributed chapters to the students in his class, and it was a wonderful book. He built his own theory of automata based on what I recall as lattices and monoids and other algebraic structures. The theory was, to me, totally un-Chomsky and un-Ullman and Hopcroft-like. That if you want to know any more about it, I can't help you because I haven't done anything with that material since I left Purdue. But it was a good course, but I have to tell you, I had to take it again to try to make sure that I could pass the qualifiers in that area. So with that now, I will turn things back to Madam Pyle. And I have to tell you, and I hope you won't be insulted, but the one thing I remember about your dad was that he walked faster than any of us could talk. The door to my office was not far from his. I think he may have had a corner office on the 4th floor. Was he in the, but he used to walk past my office frequently, and it was like a blur going past my office. And then I guess after I was there for about a year, he must have left in 72? 71, okay. So I was there for a year, and then he was gone. But I remember him walking very, very briskly. So anyway.
Thank you. That's a great story. I apologize, I did not make a PowerPoint, but we have some pictures. And I have my computer in front of me, and I'm going to open it and turn it on so I can give you the actual title of some of his latest research when I get there. So just a second here. My sister, Jana, is in the audience, and I don't know, we identified her earlier, but not by name. That's her right there, Jana Pyle. My father was a proud father of 4 children. I am daughter number 2, Jana's daughter number 1. We were numbered. My brother was not a daughter. He was son. He was son number 1, and I will never forget the day he was born. My father, Jan, and I were sleeping in our room. It was really early at 4 in the morning, and he came into our bedroom. We were in twin beds, and he jumped. We were asleep in the beds. He jumped on her bed and jumped back and forth from my bed to her bed. It's a son. So that was wonderful, wonderful. That was my brother Aaron, and then I have a younger sister, Devin Pyle, who is a museum professional, a wonderful museum professional. My father really valued education. I guess I could turn this down. My father really valued education, and he said, if I'm going to leave you anything, it's going to be a good education. And so he basically said, whatever schools you get into, if they're really good, we're going to get you into them. So my sister went to Rice, I went to Princeton, my brother went to Earlham, and my younger sister went to Oberlin. And we're all still paying on our loans. But anyhow, no, that's not true. Our father, no, my father, he never stopped working. The way you saw him walk by your office, he lived like that. And in fact, our family vacations, we thought he was vacationing too, but somehow he wasn't. We were at Cocoa Beach, and he was never there in the morning, and only a while later we figured out, he's over at NASA working. But he would join us, in the afternoon and rent a surfboard, and he was quite good on the surfboard, and he'd get out there in the water and show us how to surf. This quote apparently Dennis heard from him. Excuse me. Is that verified, Dennis? Okay. He was born in Crawfordsville, by the way. So he was, and the Piles actually, we believe, came down the river boat of the Ohio and landed in White County in southern Illinois, and then they sort of drifted up and over. Our family farm, Jan lives there still. Our grandfather, his father, Leonard Pyle, had a dry goods store in Jamestown. But anyhow, so we're from around here, and we've moved all over. But my father, the things he taught his 4 children, we all feel very strongly about. We all are artists of some sort, in addition to having learned how to program computers so that we could eat. And just really quick, I think you guys heard enough of my father's background, but in 1952 is when he got his Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering from Rose Poly, which is now Rose-Hulman. Jana now works there. And that same year, of course, he came to Purdue and was, I think jumped right in and at that exciting time. So by 54, he had his master's in mathematics, and then by 1960, he had his PhD, again in mathematics, and you've already heard all the things that happened in between. It was a heady time. I remember, I was born in 57, Jana 55. I remember the energy in the house, and I remember how when he was home on the weekends working, there'd be a card table. I don't know how he got all his papers on that card table, but somehow he did. And he would be working in the living room near the we had one of those consoles that had a record player at one end and a TV in the middle, and he liked to listen to albums of Broadway shows. So he would listen to, we had the sound recording of The Music Man and South Pacific were 2 favorites. So quite often he would, when he was taking a break, he would get up and dance with one of us if we were home. And you would stand on his feet, and he was a really good dancer. And he and my mother, who married in 1954, Joe Pyle, both enjoyed dancing. But anyhow, so I'm actually a professional dancer, choreographer. I first learned to dancing on my father's feet. But also the thing that a lot of people don't know about him, he had perfect pitch and played the piano, not trained, could sit at the piano and play, and he had a beautiful voice, absolutely beautiful voice. My younger sister has a beautiful voice. My brother made recordings, was also very talented in music. So he used to tell us all mathematicians are talented in music. They just develop it or not. So anyhow, growing up with him was absolutely incredible. We learned so many things. We lived fast. We traveled a lot, I thought, because in the summers he always worked somewhere. We would be in New Jersey at Bell Labs, and we would be in Florida, and then later on, actually, when I was in school, we were at Stanford. He had a project there, and I was a student at Princeton at the time, so that summer he hired me to work for him. I was doing programming, and I assisted him on a project at Stanford. It was pretty exciting. I thought everybody's life was like this, but he was just so generous with his time and his brilliance to his students. I remember many times students calling him late at night. He never turned anybody away for help. I want to mention this for sure. His areas of great interest were numerical analysis, which you guys know, mathematical programming, and lastly, supercomputers. He was a trailblazer. He was one of those people that would tell you a few years ahead of time something was going to happen. And he was one of the early people who was saying, supercomputing, that's it. And so his latest research, which was called steep facet selection, and it was sort of a variation on the simplex method, he was trying to he was at UH by this point. In 1971, we left West Lafayette and moved to Houston for him to chair the computer science program there. And they didn't have an undergrad program, so that's part of why they hired him. He built their undergraduate program, but he was also sort of trying to repeat what he did here, which was basically convince people computers are the wave of the future. And he really worked hard at getting the understanding of the need for networks. But so his need to have networks so he could use supercomputers, because of his steep facet selection work, he needed the supercomputer to crunch all the numbers. And he would describe it to me, and in fact, Dennis, you can show us the next slide. I'm sorry, I skipped that. This is actually, you go back. That's 1963. That is the console of the 7090, and I believe that's when they got it. because Dr. Conti is there. Is that Dean Hawkins, the other gentleman? Does anyone know? That someone thought that might be. But now you can see there's some big wigs in the background, it looks like to me. And my father, I can tell by his smile, he was feeling pretty good. Because if you read the document he wrote, you can tell he was really worried about what he calls the UNIVAC fiasco, which was a back and forth thing. So he was very happy when this machine arrived. At any rate, so this was my father when we were here. By the time we got to Houston, and now you can give me, there we go. This little thing he's holding was this model. We had them at our house that he would try to explain to us what he was doing. Basically, if you are using the simplex method, you go around the edges of the model to find the solution, and it takes longer to get to the solution. He was doing something where you would try to find the steepest facet and then go down in the middle of the facet. So you would cut your time substantially. And so he had these little models, and he would explain this to us, and we go, yes, Dad, I understand. But anyhow, he was working on that till the day he died, almost up to the moment he died. He had graduate students coming into the hospital room. He was very, very excited to keep going. But he also knew, in the hospital, he knew there was a possibility he might not survive. He was going through different kinds of surgery and recovery issues. He actually had a brain tumor, which was very rare, a certain kind, and they were able to remove it, but the complications afterwards. But anyhow, during this time, he was very aware, and he actually said to me, if I'm not around, I will be with you in everything you do. And I have never forgotten that, and I have always felt very good about it. So he's probably here right now. But the other thing I want to mention is when he was at UH, he continued to be beloved by his students. He was year after year voted the outstanding teacher, I think, in the department in that area. And another thing I want to mention, he was an Eagle Scout, which is actually very, very much a part of who he was. It fits with the computer work and being an engineer. And so I want to thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this, because it has helped me. It's almost 20 years exactly. He died on April 22nd, 1993. And it has really been a wonderful healing thing for me to be able to come and join with you, hear your stories, and be able to share. And now I'm going to let my sister say a couple things because she'll pinch me otherwise. Yeah, she's a pincher. She actually, I think she programmed in BASIC, right? COBOL. I was a Fortran programmer. So, yeah, Fortran. Okay.
Nothing's wrong with COBOL. To my father's great chagrin, he had 4 artistic children. And we all had to take advanced math, we had to take advanced science. He could not figure out how he could have had these 4 artistic children. And through our undergraduate days and graduate school days, all of our letters, had recipes for how we were not going to starve if we would just listen to the true way, which was, but because we didn't change, because we didn't, turn around and somehow or another follow him, he gravitated towards us. And something that I had shared with Robin is my father was at the forefront of computer art. Before there were any exhibitions, my dad, because he was trying to connect to us, was a sponsor of some of the first art exhibits in the country that were computer art. And in the beginning of computer art, to print something meant that you had to have time at night when nobody else was using the computer, and you could only print one color at a time. So once the piece was actually done, it could be a week later from when you began it. That was how it was in the very beginning. I wanted to say that when he was in the process of dying, my dad had a magazine in the hospital that had one of the first notebook computers in it. And before we knew what was happening, he was on the phone to the company and had ordered it. Ordered it to be delivered. And he was talking to a salesman. I'm not even sure that it was for sale, but he had convinced them that they were going to ship it to him in the hospital. That's one of my fondest memories.
I have one more thing to say. And so here's my conclusion after listening to you guys, and you all remind me of him. Just hearing your energy is wonderful. I think, thinking about that book, The Right Stuff, I think my dad had the right stuff, and I think I'm lucky that he was my dad, and that he shared it with me, and I see him here, and you. He shared it with me and all his kids, and also I think that is the energy of this place. That is the energy, that going ahead and just knowing you're going in the right direction, not necessarily know where it's going, but heading that way. And so I'm proud to be here and a part of it.
Two more things. I wanted to say, I think my father was someone who supported, he could not support us in computer science because we wouldn't go there.
That's not true.
Well,
True,
you
that's not
could,
true.
you did, okay. But he was so supportive of women being educated. Our contemporaries didn't get the push that we got. And the other thing, I know Robin has mentioned it to some of you, but I thought I'd mention it. My father one night when he was working late at the new building, turned around and accidentally walked into one of the columns and cut himself quite seriously and left this wonderful bloody mark on the column. And we, year after year, would go there and find it and point it out to friends. So we feel like he really made his mark, and we were part of that.
It was actually just a tiny little spot. Thank you so much.
While Frank is coming back up, I just wanted to give you a little background on that quote that on the first pile slide. That's how he tried to talk me into coming to Purdue. It worked.
Just a few words of thanks. I used some things Gene Spafford wrote about Norm Gibbs. I ran across something by a gentleman named Bill Caudle, whom I never heard of, who knew a lot about Maury Halstead and had followed Maury from one place to another and documented some of his own experiences, and that's how I found out about some of the history of Maury Halstead. Various internet resources and my own recollections of J.R. Buchey. Purdue had an article about Saul Rosen, which had a lot of stuff in it that I never knew. But mostly, I want to thank everybody here and the faculty who've passed on, and at least one who's still here, two who are still here. You all had an impact that I don't know if you've sat back to think about the non-technical, non-mathematical impact that you had on the students who've passed through these doors, but it's considerable. And I think ACM and AFIP and all the SIGs and all the other computer organizations that we know about were huge beneficiaries of many of the students who went to Purdue. And the faculty must have had something to do with that, because I don't think it just happened. I also want to thank Peter Denning. I was hoping to see him here, but I know he doesn't travel much anymore because. Okay.
He did send us a profile, though.
Good, because Peter was really instrumental in my survival here. We had he encouraged me frequently when I needed the encouragement. We talked about a number of different things about how to approach certain problems and just how to approach research in general. I still owe Peter a debt of gratitude, which I'm still waiting to repay. So thank you, John, especially for all the things that happened with Fortran back in the early 70s. I know that some of the graduate students who were teaching introductory Fortran had written some documentation that we used in the first version of the book we wrote, which was probably the best one. After that, things went downhill. So, and Denny, thank you for doing this. I know there was a lot of frivolity and happiness and joy and pleasure here, but I tend to think that these things are important because otherwise this all gets lost. I know at Temple we have a new regime of people, and they just took the older clan, the older group of people who were there, and they just pushed them aside like they didn't matter, like they didn't have anything that they could contribute of any significance or utility. They just pushed them aside and went their own way, which I guess is their privilege, but I think a lot is lost when that happens. So this was a good thing. Thank you.
I've put up pictures and names of people we know of who are deceased, not all of which we had an opportunity to say anything about, but all of which we miss, all of whom we miss very much. Thank you. You're up, Dick. You want me to run it, or do you want to do the slides?
I guess I can do.
Okay. Let me just do a little bit of an intro here. One of the most significant things about our era is that we did all this during the late 60s and early 70s, which was a very tumultuous time in our career and in our nation's history. Of course, there was the Vietnam War. There were protests against the Vietnam War, and even though Purdue was not notorious for that, in fact, it was considered a hotbed of student rest. There were, in fact, some very severe implications. You're going to see something very shortly about student protests against tuition increases and things like that. I want to talk to you just briefly about a personal impact. If you go up to the stadium and go to the left, there's married student housing. And if you go up the hill, there's some housing that was actually built 69 time frame. And in 68 or so, there were a lot of student protests, and particularly at Indiana University, because they were more the artistic protest-a-lot types. Purdue was more the engineer, ignore the protesters types. But anyway, so what happened is the state legislature decided they were going to punish those out-of-state agitators, which that was their perspective, which was all the demonstrations was out-of-state agitators. It wasn't actually Indiana residents doing that. Some of you may remember that. And so they decided to cut the budget, which you'll see some things about in a moment. Well, the interesting thing was they said, we're going to cut the budget for the universities. And then they got together and they realized that most of them had gone to Indiana University because they were lawyers. So they cut Purdue's budget more than Indiana's. So we suffered because of the protests at Indiana, but how it affected me is I was moving into that married student complex I mentioned, and it was a building designed to be air conditioned, which meant that the windows either didn't open or were little tiny little things, and there were various other details of the way the building was designed that was designed to be air conditioned. But what did they do when they cut the budget? Well, let's just cut out the air conditioning. So imagine you're in August and September in Indiana moving into a building that doesn't have any air conditioning and it doesn't have windows that can open very much. So you're sweltering. And they said, well, you can buy a room air conditioner, $300 or $400, and put it in this special hole they put in the side of the building. Here I was trying to finish up my PhD, figuring I was going to be out of here in 3 months. Am I going to spend $300 or $400, twice my monthly salary, on an air conditioner? No, we just had to put up with the heat. But we all blame all those radicals at Indiana University for all the suffering we went through. So with that, I will move on to let Dick Smiley have the podium and talk about a little more about this background here. So here you are, Dick. Let's see, let's get the full screen version. You can either move it with this or with that. And you need the mic.
Yes. Is it on? Okay. Okay. Will this? Yes. Good. Okay. We're not going to start with quite what
Denny was talking about. You'll see how this fits in a minute. There was a group called the Reformed Druids of North America, founded in the spring of 1963 at Carleton College, a little college in Minnesota where I, and as it turns out later, Hal Hart went to college. Now, when I talk about these people, you have to understand when a Reformed Druid talks about the Reformed Druids, if you can tell whether he's serious, he's a failure. A friend of mine was one of the founders, wanted me to join. I finally joined a year later in 1964. A couple years after I graduated from Carleton, I showed up at Purdue, January 1967, to work on an MS in mathematics. First, I spent all my time on math. By 1968, I wanted to spend some time outdoors, and also hanging around in the computer science department. I had worked for a year and a half at a little company called Control Data between graduating from Carleton and coming to Purdue. So I went to concerts at Slater Center. That's fine. In the fall, I decided it's time for Purdue to have a chapter of the, or a grove, as we called it, of the Reformed Druids. So I'd start up some services. I'll skip the draft connection for the moment. So we had these weekly religious-themed celebrations, let's say. Now, for the Reformed Druids, Halloween, or as it was known back in the good old days, Samhain, was a big deal. So, I did a lot of planning, and with help from some other people, including Rich Reagan, Bill DeVonzo, maybe some others. I guess Ed Trishman, you said, that rings a bell with me too. Anyway, on Halloween, the congregants all met in the wind tunnel, where there ought to be a first floor of the math science building. And we trooped down the stairs to the machine room. I believe that they did not have it locked down yet at that point. Either that or they knew me and just buzzed me on in, along with all my closest friends. Anyway, so we all stood outside the machine room in a place which the others didn't know, but I knew, was where you could see the graphics console. Graphics console, you may say? Almost nobody knows about that. Well, there was... Where'd it go? Where'd it go? There we go. There's the graphics console. Now, picture, it's from where we were standing, it's off halfway across the room. You could see it in a gap in all the controllers, cabinets, and so forth. Okay, so after everybody was gathered around me, I did some suitable incantations, performed the mystic druid symbol like that, while carefully facing the graphics console. My accomplice, this is magician talk, was watching my reflection in the controller, in the front of the controller's cabinet, and as I swooped down, he hit the button that started up the graphics console. Ta-da! This actually is a very bad artist's conception of what it looked like, but there was a satisfying gasp from the assembled multitudes. And then we trooped back up the stairs and drove down to the banks of the Wabash and did some religiously themed stuff and had a nice bonfire. And I think Rich came up with the idea of jumping over the flames of the bonfire.
That's traditional, but students were never averse to drinking the waters of life, which is, of course, a small business.
Okay, now here are these are actually pictures not from that particular celebration, but a few weeks earlier. The guy in the religious robes that may look strangely like a bed sheet is me. Facing me is Bill DeVonzo there. I don't recognize the other people. Another people contemplating the candle. Okay.
From the Purdue Expo.
Yes, that was the Purdue Exponents coverage. Now I'm escape. Huh? Okay. Delete. Oh, sorry. Here we go. Do I double click? Okay. Okay. I'm having trouble getting the gain. There we go. All right. Okay, so now let's talk about the draft. The way it worked was when you were a young man, age 18, you registered for the draft. Preferred age for drafting was 25, working down toward the younger ages as the pool dried up. Unfortunately, there was this little war going on in Vietnam. Now, later, the lotteries implemented. I'm not going to talk about that. How did you get out of the draft? You get a deferment. They were pretty generous at first with deferments. Then, as the pool was drawn down, there were also exemptions, a few categories. I'll talk about that in a minute. In the end, if you didn't get a deferment or exemption, you ended up in classification 1A, at which point you start looking for some way out of this. All right. You could appeal. When you were reclassified, with presumably 1A, you had 30 days to appeal. If you wanted to, you could first do a personal appearance. Maybe I have those two reversed. Before the draft board. Then, if you got an adverse ruling, you appeal to a second level. So there's a significant number of steps. All right. So now we'll come back to the Druids. Okay. The paperwork option is what I chose, and I chose a Druid theme to imitate. And if that didn't work out, I was going to go on an extended sightseeing trip of Canada. All right. So I applied for an exemption as a minister. I hadn't actually gotten the Purdue Grove founded yet. The official protocol was you had to have certain offices filled. And we hadn't gotten there yet, but anyway. So the idea was when the draft board started questioning me, I would supply supporting documentation and would get the main grove at Carleton College to supply supporting documentation. So out of the generosity of my heart, I printed up business stationery, not just for the Purdue Grove, but also for the Carleton Grove. It was nice stuff. The Druid symbol was in green, and then the rest was in black on mine. Oh, it was great. And I talked to the Archdruid of the Carleton Grove, wrote me a letter or two of, so-so support. We got this problem that he hasn't really started up the Grove yet, but Okay, I had a friend mail all of my letters from San Francisco so they would get the postmark they needed, but would take as long as possible to get to the Indiana, well, no, it was Illinois actually, my draft board. Okay, so my first appeal was rejected. I went to the draft board for a personal appearance. All these old guys who'd probably been in World War II or something were willing to give me a hearing, but yeah, I did my best to make it difficult to decide whether I was serious or not. I was rejected again. I sent my appeal to the next level. All of these letters that I sent were certified mail, return receipt requested. That was told to me to be very important. Well, next step, I was ordered to appear for a pre-induction physical. Things are looking a little dicey. I passed the physical. Things were looking dicier. I was ordered to appear for induction on August 18th, 1969. Happy 26th birthday from Uncle Sam. At this point, I decided I better call a draft lawyer. Being a stingy graduate student type, I called someone who would do a little free. He said, you better call the draft board and straighten this out. So I called him, spoke to the chief clerk, the woman who'd been signing all these things I've been getting. She found my request. It was stapled behind a letter from the Archdruid, Carlton Grove, which had apparently arrived the same day. Whoops. She said, but I don't know when yours was mailed. Can you prove that? I said, I have a return receipt. Shall I send you a copy? This sounded, I could hear the disappointment in her voice, but she said, well, who signed it? So I figured out who signed it, read it off to her. That apparently convinced her. My induction notice was rescinded. I was reclassified as being beyond